Well, George, I just heard the cannon go off, so it is 12
Oh,
o'clock and we're gonna get started. I
perfect.
see attendees are joining pretty steadily here.
Okay.
Welcome, folks. My name's Tyler Colburn. I am the professional development consultant with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. I use he and them pronouns. I've only been here 2 weeks, and so this is my second panel or second session, I should say, for professional development series here. And today we're joined with George Savoury, and the discussion we're having today on this lunch and learn is around social work ethics and supervision. So a reminder, this does count towards your 40 hours of professional development, and this could also qualify for your 1 hour of ethics training that is required every year. We are getting close to renewal time, which is wild to think that the year is like towards the end. But that's the reality that we face today, I guess, as the time goes past and we're getting prepared for another year. I'm hoping you folks who are joining the call are enjoying these last few days of summer in August. This is always my favorite time of year. Lots of great produce. The weather's usually really good. So I hope you're enjoying as much as I am. Before we get started, we are going to go through a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to encourage you and invite you to join me in the chat by acknowledging the name of where you are with the Indigenous Mi'kmaq place name. And so I just posted in the link there, placenames.mapdev.ca, and that can tell you where the land it is that you're located, the name of it. Let's see here. So I'm going to read directly from this slide, apologies, but I want you to join me in this land acknowledgement. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Mi'kma'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. I'm in Kutupuk today, but I live in Punamukutijik over on the other side of the harbor, colonially known as Dartmouth. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982 and remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. I'm a settler Canadian. My ancestry is predominantly from the English and Irish sides of the United Kingdom, and I feel really grateful and privileged to live here. And I also see my settler responsibility as a series of accountabilities to the land and to the people who have inherited this place for or lived in this place for a millennia and longer. And so I hope you enjoy me in looking up your place name and putting it in the chat, and also encourage you to say how you're arriving today. How are you feeling as we start this call? So when we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truth. So in this image here, you see on the left-hand side a cross section of a tree stump, but then on the right-hand side, you see a cross or a fingerprint. And I love this image because it really speaks to the entanglement and the interconnectedness of humans as beings on this land. Um, I have a post here up here on my wall in my office that says, it's from Decolonial Futures. It says, understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around. So we're not separate and distinct from the earth and from the planet. We are expressions of nature. And seeing this interconnectedness is one of the ways that we can strive for decolonial practice. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice in this community that we share, by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. I see some folks putting in where they're arriving from today. Thank you so much. And a reminder, we are all treaty people. Sometimes it's easy for people, especially settler Canadians like myself, to think, the treaties apply to Indigenous folks, but they don't. They apply to everyone on this land. And so as we consider that and consider how we can decolonize and support indigenization, how does this impact what we do and how we do it? How will it guide our work together today? So as we're thinking about clinical supervision, and the ethics of that, how does decolonization and Indigenous resurgence connect into that? The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is also committing to translating this acknowledgement into action. By seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's calls to action, we commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Some of you might be familiar with the upcoming revisions to our Code of Ethics and Standards, and we are striving to have a stronger commitment to truth and reconciliation and decolonization in these standards. Of course, it's important to hold on to an intersectional lens. And so earlier, and I talked about that entanglement, that interconnectedness, it can be helpful to think about intersectionality and the many layers of identities and experiences that are cross-cutting and intersecting within oppression. So all oppression is connected. Decolonizing ourselves and our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. So again, as a settler Canadian myself, I'm aware of and recognize that the benefits and privileges I have today are tied to settler colonialism, and my identity and my ancestry is complicit in it. Each of us, depending on our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For those who might be of African descent, the forces of dispossession that uprooted them from their land, brought to Turtle Island against their will, are part of the white supremacy and slave trade that it was fueled by the settlement of this continent. So understanding and connecting to the idea that colonization is interwoven into the displacement and enslavement of the people of African descent. So we take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us and upon our practice. And then, of course, social work, as many of you probably know, has three areas of practice: the micro, the meso, and the macro. We can also take an ecological systems theory approach to deepen our understanding of a systemic lens on social work practice across the chronosystem, macrosystem, exosystem, meso, micro, and then the individual. So holding on to a systemic lens can help us see beyond the individual experiences of social work. So again, today we are joined by George Savoury. George, I'm going to read out some of your bio here. I hope that's okay. But George is part of Savoury Consulting Limited and is dedicated to empowering leaders and child protection family service organizations to achieve success more strategically and effectively. George's expertise in social work, child and family services, and executive leadership, is leveraged to conduct program and policy reviews and engagement strategies, provide clinical supervision training, and facilitate workplace conflict resolution. His comprehensive reviews assess the organization's resources and readiness to address issues that may arise. George R. Savoury, the founder of Savoury Consulting Limited, brings a wealth of experience in social services and policy development. His journey as a social worker has seen him assume supervisory, management, and senior executive roles within the Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia governments. His senior government positions include Assistant Deputy Minister, Executive Director, and Regional Director and Director. He's also taught social policy in the BSW program at Dalhousie University School of Social Work. George has a BA, BSW, and an MSW, and is a board-certified diplomat in clinical social work from the American Board of Clinical Social Work. He's accredited by the Association for Psychological Therapies in Clinical Supervision and approved for private practice as a clinical specialist by the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. This is an abbreviated bio, and I encourage you to reach out to George. And so you see his email on the chat or on the screen here. I'm also going to put it in the chat for everyone. And then a reminder that this session today is part of one of our many sessions that we hold here at the College of Social Workers. So I encourage you, if you haven't signed up for our newsletter or follow us on social media or subscribe to us on YouTube, this session is recorded today and will be uploaded at a later date on our YouTube channel as well for people to view on their own time. George, with that, I am going to pass it over to you and start your slideshow. Oh, just see there's someone has a question. Just give me 1 second here. Wanda, I see you have your hand up. I encourage you to ask a question in the chat if possible. We are going to have time for questions about the session overall at the end, hopefully. But if you have a question particular to technology or something that could be supporting you to be here today, just send it in the chat to me privately and I can respond that way. Me, George, while I just get your slides up here. So hopefully everyone, oh, you don't have a question, Wanda. Okay, sorry, Geez, I just see a hand up there. George, I am going to go on mute and pass it over to you and just guide me along when you want me to change the slides,
Okay.
but it's happy to pass it over to you, and I'm so grateful that you're here to join us today.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone, and happy Friday. Thanks for the kind introductory comments there, Tyler. And we'll jump in. So maybe we could just go to the first slide. We're going to cover, this is a quick overview of clinical supervision. It's actually based on a day-long session that I did for all of the supervisors recently on Prince Edward Island who work in child and family services. And we're going to talk about the three functions of clinical supervision: normative, formative, the learning aspect, and restorative. We're going to talk a little bit about a definition of supervision. Next slide, Tyler. We're going to speak to methods of supervision, most common. Models of supervision, there's quite a few, and I'm just going to quickly reference one for you. We're going to talk about using questions for supervision, and using effective questions can help facilitate clinical supervision. Next one. We're going to talk about ethics and social work practice and some of the issues that workers confront, either with coworkers and clients, and that they should feel comfortable raising with their supervisor. Some of the power dynamics in the relationship, and the importance of a policy on clinical supervision as well. So we'll jump right in. I know we have limited time, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions. If not, you have my email there, as Tyler mentioned. So it's very typical that the best performing social workers end up being promoted to the role of supervisor. And it's always interesting why sometimes, even though they are the best performing social workers, they struggle. So maybe we could just jump to the next one. And I think I've covered, basically it's based on this session is based on a session, or a number of sessions I recently did in PEI, and hopefully the session will embrace you to want to learn more about clinical supervision, and I'll be sharing how you can some things you could do to help your organization embrace clinical supervision. So we it's not easy for us to break into small groups here today, but normally at this point I would ask folks to break out into a session, so you could think about those individually and maybe discuss them with your one of or two of your colleagues if you felt comfortable. First of all, what's been positive for you about supervision? What's been less positive? What would you have liked to see? What would you like to see improved about clinical supervision? And what could you do to enhance clinical supervision? Because there's two parties, of course, in the process. And what would be some of the benefits if you had good supervision, good clinical supervision occurring? So, mentally defined clinical supervision, and this is a definition that you'll see used frequently. It's the formal provision by an approved supervisor of a relationship-based education and training, which is work-focused, and it's about managing, supporting, developing, and evaluating the work of colleagues. A couple things about that definition is that it is work related, and the main methods that supervisors use are helping workers in terms of corrective or supportive feedback on their performance. You're playing a role of educator or teacher, and it should be about collaborative goal setting. And it differs from coaching and mentoring, which is very important, of course, as well. but it's not a voluntary, it's not optional. I mean, once you go to work in a setting where you have a supervisor, there's an expectation that you're going to get good supervision. Next slide. I'm just going to come back for a second. I raised a question. Why did we think workers, good performing social workers, struggle when they take on a supervisory role? And one of the key reasons they struggle is we put them in the role of supervisor, but most organizations really don't invest in training them and providing ongoing training for supervisors. We kind of expect almost through osmosis that folks who've been promoted are going to be able to be good supervisors. And in fairness, social workers bring a lot of good skills, good listening skills, interviewing skills, a commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion. But we're wrong to assume that because someone has had a good experience as a social worker, they're automatically possess what you require to be a good supervisor. So very quickly, the purpose of supervision, there's three key reasons in terms of purpose: to ensure that the supervisee is carrying out sound and appropriate professional practice and following their professional standards and ethical practice. It's about facilitating the development of the supervisee in terms of their knowledge, skills, and attitude. Just quickly on attitude, I mean, if you picked up, from a social worker that they were working with folks who had addictions issues, for example, that they really didn't believe about the potential for people to change who are struggling with issues, well, that would be something you'd want to spend some time on. It should also be a supportive space for workers to process the experiences that they're having with clients and to prioritize their well-being because it's a stressful role and very demanding. So these are your three purposes of supervision. So why is supervision important? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, accountability. We take on a huge responsibility once we take on the role of social worker, and there's an accountability for a certain quality of service in terms of standards, best practices. It's required by our professional college, and it's essential, of course, for workers' professional growth and development, which supervision should play a key part in that. And also, workers deal with very complex cases, and there should be a supportive space for them to process what they're doing in terms of interventions with clients. So I mentioned in the introduction, there's really three key functions of supervision. First, the normative, which is the accountability piece, which I just mentioned, which is where the focus is on being effective at what you're doing and dealing with ethical and organizational norms and the administrative side of it, like caseload management, for example. The formative, which is the learning and development part of it, and the restorative, supporting emotional processing, reflection, and self-care, which is an important part of professional growth. It also includes reflective practice and team building. I should point out that those who may have done a course years ago on supervision, they would probably come across a name by the name of a founder, really, of clinical supervision by the name of Helfer Kadushin. And what's interesting, he coined it a different way. He said the three main functions are the educational, the supportive, and the administrative. And it really, you could really use those three as well. He more recently, Proctor has defined it a little bit differently, but ultimately it's the same as what Kadushin was saying. If we just jump to the next slide on reflective supervision. When I come to sharing with you some of the different models of supervision, what you're going to find, and if you start reading about different models, and YouTube as a really good library actually of different models of supervision. Reflective supervision, you're going to see just jumping out at you from all of them. And that is really, reflective supervision is really about the collaborative relationship between the social worker and the supervisor. And it's about the emotional processing of what's happening. And it helps develop the social worker's ability to reflect on their experiences and how they can improve their knowledge, skills, and attitudes. It's interesting if you look at this definition of reflection, which is really an activity in which we recapture our experiences, we think about it, we mull it over, we evaluate it. We don't really at times realize it, but we're almost constantly reflecting. If we do an interview with someone, or we participate in a meeting. For me, when I'm driving back to another meeting, or I'm wrapping up the end of the day, I'm mulling over how the experience went. In fact, it's interesting. Some of us actually talk to ourselves out loud, which is fine, and as our way of reflecting. And we often don't realize it, but we're constantly, after an event, saying to ourselves, well, did I ask the right question? I wish I'd covered this. I should have emphasized this more. I think the next time I'll focus more on, A, B, and C. So it's a huge part of supervision, and we often don't realize it. And a supervisor can play a real key role in helping a social worker reflect on their practice. Maybe we could jump to the next one. I have a list there of different models of supervision, and these are probably some of the most common ones. As I mentioned, YouTube has some really good videos on those and others. I'm just going to briefly share a few comments on Bernard's discrimination model, which I touch on in the next slide. So maybe if you could just jump to the next slide. So Bernard's discrimination model, he postulates that supervisors play three key roles. They play the role of teacher, probably educator might be a better word, counselor, and consultant. And the role changes based on the social worker's intervention, how they conceptualize a situation, and the personalization. Just a quick comment on the counselor role. When I use the word counselor there, supervisors shouldn't be engaging in therapy with social workers. If someone needs a social worker intervention, or could be a psychologist, they should make that recommendation to the worker. So I'll just make a couple quick comments about this example. So in terms of intervention and the counselor role, for example, if you were going to be play an educator role, right? You could have a discussion with the worker on, like, how does a family history of substance abuse influence the client's current behavior? As a counselor, you might want to reframe the client's challenging behavior. maybe they're not opening up because of self-protection, and which is normal. I was listening to a video of one of Noah Kahan's concerts the other day, and he shares very openly in his performances about how he struggled as a youth with mental health issues, and he was sharing how when he was in therapy, he really didn't he really wasn't he didn't open up until he was 20 years of age, and he really just went along with what the therapist was saying, and he didn't use the word self-protection, but you could tell that he struggled with being open, and he wanting to protect himself during those therapeutic sessions. So as a you could play as a role as a supervisor, you can throw some of those possibilities out there for why a client mightn't be opening up. Thirdly, as a consultant, you may want to focus on understanding why a particular intervention didn't work. Another way to frame it, that particular model, might be to think of 3 questions. So when you're with a social worker, obviously asking for a description of what's going on, then focusing on so what, which is really the analysis, and finally, now what? Like, where are we going to go in terms of the intervention, or how we're going to move forward. So the next slide, and there is a good video on Bernard's model on YouTube. Few things about all these models. There's no model or framework like most models that fit all situations. Most supervisors utilize aspects from various models of clinical supervision. And what you're going to find if you start diving deeper into some of these models is that you can benefit from using effective questions as a supervisor. Questions like, so what have you learned from this situation? What have you learned from the interview you just did? How would you describe the barriers that are in your way or you're facing? You can be reaffirming in terms of, and wanting to validate if what you're hearing is correct. Like, you could say, I think what you're saying is this, and then asking them, the worker, is that correct? Because maybe you're interpreting it incorrectly. And you could ask, how do you think you could turn the situation around? If you think there's an approach that they're not trying, you may want to say, what's holding you back from trying A, B, or C. The next slide. I alluded to this at the beginning about the supervisee is you're 2 key participants in the process. And while a supervisor has a major responsibility to ensure there's a good quality of supervision provided, you as a supervisee, there's some things you could do and should do to enhance supervision. So you could provide feedback to the supervisor on supervision. Make sure you fully engage in the supervisory process. You could spend and should spend time preparing for supervision, making notes of issues or concerns or developmental needs. You could ask your supervisor if it's not occurring that you'd like time set aside for clinical supervision. Next slide. You can initiate a discussion with your supervisor about problematic aspects of your work. What are some issues that you're dealing with on a particular case or family or or child. You can talk about training you feel you require. Raising the importance of a contract, and some might use the word agreement that should be developed. I'll come to that when I speak to policy, and I'm not talking about a complicated 5-page legal agreement. Being available at agreed upon times. One of the things happens is, and sometimes for valid reasons, supervision gets canceled, either on the part of the supervisor or the supervisee. But if it's happening routinely, then you got a problem that needs to be discussed and addressed. Maintaining confidentiality, and it should be kept confidential. There are, of course, sometimes issues could come up that relate to health and safety, or where you can't maintain confidentiality. For example, if child abuse would be an example where you have an obligation to report. But generally, these are not occurring routinely through supervision. Record keeping, what should the record keeping look like? Provide supervision to the supervisor on the actual supervision you're receiving. And if you have a policy, there's some really great little forms that have been developed that could be used for feedback. So maybe we could just jump to the next one. What are some of the benefits of clinical supervision? Well, the research shows that you get increased support for social workers. It affects recruitment and retention. Of course, increased accountability, more motivated workers, enhanced well-being and reduced illness, and you end up having a safe place for workers and supervisors to exchange information and reflect on feelings, issues, and actions. Next slide. Enhanced clinical skills and quality of practice usually occur if you have good supervision occurring. Increased job satisfaction and feeling valued, compliance with standards and best practices, increased self-awareness, promotion of a culture of learning, and really why we all entered this business in the first place, in terms of improved client services. And if we were in a larger group, I'd ask you to, and in person, I ask you to, what are some others? And maybe you could think about some of those. Next slide. Methods of supervision. Well, there's certain common ones that most of us use more frequently than others. The most common one would be self-reports, where we base a lot on what the worker is sharing with us. There's also process notes and case notes that we review as supervisors that help us see where workers are in their development and where they may need support and advice and direction. We don't see a lot of live and direct observation, but some might see it through, two-way mirrors, joint interviews sometimes. We don't see a lot of audio or video recordings in mental health settings. It occurs more frequently. Written feedback and surveys, sometimes that occurs. Case presentations, we would see it in team meetings, case conferences, court reports, when we see the reports that workers are doing to present a case in court would be another way. Participation in court, sometimes supervisors happen to be at a court hearing and might see it out of workers performing. Action plans or plans of care, and sometimes there's a structured review of complex and high risk cases where we observe workers presenting, and it's another way of being able to give feedback and see what issues workers may be struggling with. So these are probably the most common methods of supervision. And I'm just going to make a quick comment about probably one of the key aspects of good supervision. Hunt back in 1986 made a statement that's really true today as it was back in 1986. And he said that really the quality of the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee really determines whether supervision is effective or not. And in fact, it's essential to have trust and rapport to give feedback. So you had to build a relationship, you had to invest in it. And I would say most of us in our experiences with supervisors have found that where we've had a good, trusting, supportive relationship with our supervisor, um, it's had a profound impact on the quality of our supervision. And that relationship doesn't just occur without some work and investment and time on the part of both the supervisee and the worker. Next slide. So the supervisor also got to play a huge part in the supervisory process. So what are some ways the supervisor should be doing that? Well, participating in training on clinical supervision, being supportive and facilitating the supervisee to discuss issues, managing their practice, identifying personal and professional development issues. And when I say personal there, for example, how they can reduce stress, the importance of trying to stay healthy in terms of exercise, healthy eating, adequate sleep, separating their work from their personal family life and trying to keep it in balance. Providing feedback to the supervisee on their clinical reasoning, organizational skills, preparation. They should be preparing for supervision, thinking in advance of issues they should be discussing, ensuring there's a supervisory agreement or contract, and discussing serious issues if there are any that they see, like, for example, ethical issues, if they see harassment, for example, occurring. So there's it doesn't just happen. You got to invest in making it work. We could probably jump to the next slide. I should just share this with you about the training recently I was doing in PEI. After I finished training all the supervisors, I got a request asking me, would you do the session for the social workers? And first I was kind of struck by, because usually I'm doing the training for supervisors only. And so we did a half-day session for all the workers. And it was actually phenomenal and quite interesting to hear from workers about supervision, what they expect, what's been their experiences. And it was interesting, some of the things they came up with about facilitating and supporting supervision. One of the workers said, I find we get constantly interrupted. So someone's knocking on the door and saying, I need to see the supervisor right away. And one of the workers said, "Well, we some of us now have we put a sign that we stick on the door saying supervisory session, in progress." And another worker said, "I put on it, that the session will be ending at." Say 2:30 p.m. So that way it lets the worker know, well, we're not going to be there all afternoon. So if you have an emergency, within half an hour, 50 minutes, you're going to have an opportunity to see your supervisor. But it was, they were phenomenal in terms of ideas and issues they raised. So the power dynamic. Most supervisors and social workers work in a hierarchical environment where supervisors have a higher rank, and the supervisors hold a lot of cards. They include recognition, performance ratings, which affects pay raises, promotions, development opportunities, and work assignments. Next slide. So this power imbalance could, as you could expect, may cause a supervisor to hold back on giving feedback, sharing mistakes. So we can see that the power is heavily weighted in the favor of the supervisor. So a supervisor has a huge responsibility to be aware of that and the importance of balancing it and to be fair and ethical. Uh, as they perform the role of supervisor. Next slide. Just a moment there. In terms of racial equity, just a couple of slides there. Culturally competent supervision requires an acute awareness of the culture of each supervisor staff members, respect for their values, and a commitment to eliminate oppression and discrimination. And culturally responsive and inclusive practice is one of the 6 practice standards of the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. And I know Tyler mentioned that earlier in terms of our code of ethics, and the college has a deep commitment to racial equity and inclusion and diversity, and invests a lot in terms of training and webinars in this whole area. So next slide. I think this is a very accurate quote. When child family service social workers have strong feelings of inclusion, and when there's a positive organizational diversity climate, they have less intent to leave and are more committed and more satisfied with their work. And it is so true. And we cannot do too much training and participating in opportunities to increase our awareness around unconscious biases and diversity. So quickly, I'm going to jump to in the next slide, ethics, which was and conflict of interest. Again, very much a part of the code, and the importance of us being aware as supervisors about informed consent in terms of sharing information, ensuring clients are aware of what they're consenting to or not consenting to, non-discrimination, dual relationships in the workplace, and how it can impact practice, and the importance of discussing it and dealing with it, confidentiality, professional boundaries issues, harassment and sexual harassment in particular, being aware of situations where someone may be providing service or advice beyond their scope of practice, and seeking regular supervision and consultation. So workers should feel comfortable, and the supervisor should be providing a safe place for those discussions. And if you have an ethical dilemma, you're unsure of a situation, you should be adhering to professional practice standards and guidelines. But if you have conflict, or you think there's a conflict, supervision is really a forum where you should be bringing those issues forward for discussion. I'm very conscious we're doing okay. I think time-wise, I'm going to share with you what Davies has come up with 6 stages of how to run structured supervision. And I'm going to cover it quickly, but it works. Since I've had an opportunity to participate in training that Davies does on clinical supervision, I've taken the opportunity to share his approach in every session that I do on clinical supervision. And it's an easy one to remember. So first of all, when you begin a supervision session, a good thing to do, of course, is to ask how things been since the last time you met. Agree on what should be discussed today, which is really focuses on being collaborative. Not just what I want to discuss as a supervisor or issues that the worker want to discuss. What should we focus on today? To then get on with it and address the topics that you agreed on in the second bullet. Agree on tasks or work to be completed for the next session. So you may there may be you may want to suggest a different approach to either handling a matter, or maybe there's a video or webinar that you think that they could benefit from that you'd want to talk about at your next session. So reaching agreement on it, summarizing. Probably one of the most important things you could do in clinical supervision or any meeting, even if you're chairing a staff meeting, is before you all get up and walk away, you summarize very quickly what we discussed today and what we agreed on. And sometimes what we might think we agreed on may not, in fact, be accurate. So doing the summary is really a good way to reach agreement on and be sure what you're doing or what you agreed to follow up on the next time. Ask for feedback, like what about the session today? What did you like about it? What do you think worked well? What would you like? Were there any issues or aspects of this session today that you felt could be improved? How would you like? Are there some things for the next time you'd like to see us do differently? So it's a easy model to remember, and it brings structure to your session. Next slide. I'm going to quickly go. I'm going to skip this one. And probably the next one as well. And you have them, so you could take a look at them. I'm going to skip that one. And I'll just say on the agreeing on the task, be realistic about what you're going to agree on for between now and your next session. The next slide. Summarize. I think I've covered that one. Next one. I would say your last two are so important. Ask for their feedback on how well the session went and how it could be improved. Next session. I believe if you're really going to have good supervision, your organization should have a policy on clinical supervision. Why? Because it communicates the importance to everyone about clinical supervision, why it is important. It recognizes that you need resources in terms of adequate staff, training, and support. Next slide. Having a policy on clinical supervision, you should have included in the policy that what is supervision, a definition, the functions of clinical supervision. You should speak to the role of the supervisor and supervisee. Make it clear it's different than performance appraisal. You should speak to how confidentiality will be dealt with. Next slide. How you're going to record the sessions and agreed upon on actions. It should speak to the importance of a supervision agreement, frequency and duration. Clinical supervision should, by the way, should be a minimum of 1 hour per month. And the feedback part of it is so important in terms of how you can enhance supervision. How are you going to manage conflict if conflict comes up during supervision, and giving feedback. Next slide. So in conclusion, supervision is really all about a relationship of rapport and trust between the supervisor and the supervisee, to reflect on their practice in order to develop their capabilities and how they will process emotional responses to their work. There's 3 core functions: normative, which is the accountability piece; formative, which is the development, educational aspect; and restorative, which is so important about self-care. And by the way, research shows that workers who feel there's a focus in supervision on their well-being are more likely to stay in their work environment. We've talked about different models and people drawing on the model that works best for you. Next slide. So supervision is much more than a focus on the normative administrative. And by the way, most of us, that's what we get in supervision. We talk about caseload management, closing cases, opening cases, what's our workload, and vacations. And don't get me wrong, I mean, those are important aspects of our work. But if your supervision is primarily focused on a normative or administrative, it'd be fair to say you're not getting very good clinical supervision, or very much clinical supervision. Supervisees require it for their development, and both are accountable for making it work. And it's essential to your professional practice. So it's 12:52. I do believe it's important that you as workers and as supervisors advocate for policy and for training on clinical supervision. I've been working on one for Prince Edward Island it's in the final stages of approval, and I think it's so important. And of course, it places an onus then on the responsibility on the organization to support workers, make sure that they have the proper ratio of supervisors to supervisees, to promote training. And of course, clinical supervision is key to improving client outcomes, professional development, and compliance with ethical and professional standards. I find it interesting those days. Many organizations will hear reference to transformation, and I think an interesting question would be is where is clinical supervision in the transformation process? Because clinical supervision has the potential to change practice and improve client outcomes tremendously. And so I think it would be a good question to say where is clinical supervision in that process. Next slide. So we've come to our final slide. I want to thank you for joining the webinar, and thanks for all you do to bring hope, support, and services, and what you do every day to support children, youth, and families. You do very important but also demanding work, and clinical supervision is a way and a process to make that more effective and better outcomes, and also support you in the process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George, and a wonderful presentation. And I was thinking as you were talking about how much of the principles and the content you were sharing is applicable to so many other areas of life as well. You know, you made that note around how the way of engaging in the clinical supervision and the questions you can ask and how you could structure that meeting and how that could go for a staff meeting as well. I think what the organizations I've worked at that were most effective, the most joyful to work in, the most, equitable and principled, that's how they were structured. You know what I mean? So these are lessons that are cross-cutting.
Yeah, well, you said it perfectly, Tyler. And it was interesting. After I did the training with Davies on the 6 steps for structured supervision, I realized some areas I could improve on
Mm,
in terms of meetings, uh, and the importance of summary at the end, which I would kind of assume sometimes that, well, we all know what we agreed on,
mm,
and it's just not always true. And also feedback in terms of taking a few minutes, like, okay, we've had this meeting. Are there ways we could, in our next one, could we do better, or did we miss some things? So it not only works, as you say, in you can use it in our personal lives, but you can also use it in group settings. And I didn't touch on peer supervision and group supervision, which are two other forms because of time, but they're also really neat ways of getting supervision. But I caution people, because I've been in meetings where folks have said, well, we do peer supervision or group supervision. So then I asked them to tell me about it.
mm,
And while there's some elements of it that they're doing correctly, I also realize that because of the absence of some training, there's some risk to uh, the way they're doing it. So yeah,
hmm. Yeah, I
thank
mean
you.
that's Um, folks, I know some people are dropping off the call. We are getting towards the end. I don't think we have time for questions today, but what I can commit to is if you do want to email me questions you have, I can work with George and get them back to people, maybe in a blog or something like that, because I imagine there are questions bubbling up for folks. Also, you're welcome to reach out to George directly. And a reminder, he does do some consulting as well and is available for but bringing some of his expertise and wisdom to maybe your work context. George, any final thoughts or statements from you as we wrap up this call?
Well, I would say it's been a pleasure doing this webinar. As I mentioned yesterday, it's actually my first webinar. I've been a participant in so many, in recent years, and especially once COVID occurred. And usually, I'm doing them live, and you get the benefit of the group and one-on-one interaction, which is not easy through webinars, but it's been a pleasure, and hopefully the folks who have been able to join can benefit and can take something away from it. So, and thank you, Tyler, for your work organizing it.
Thanks, and I just want to give a shout out to Naj, who I don't think is on the call, but who, I'm filling in the role that Naj was previously in, and they have done a lot of work of developing relationships and setting up content like today's webinar. So I just got to walk in and get to have a good relationship with you, meet you, George, for the first time. So I'm just grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very
Well,
much.
folks, I'm going to stop recording and we'll end this for today. Reminder that the call will be available